Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 12th of December. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, war between West and Russia imminent. Join the chorus of patriots speaking out. And Murray inquiry protects predatory banks from Glass-Steagall. So first, British Obama war on Russia imminent. Join the chorus of patriots speaking out. Craig, at the moment, the president of Ukraine is in town. Actually, he came in Melbourne yesterday. I noticed on the news, Tony Abbott dusted off his extreme rhetoric about Malaysian Flight 17 and the downing of it. This is a quote from him yesterday. He said, "This is an atrocity, an absolute atrocity. It was mass murder on a vast scale," end quote. Now, of course, the assumption in that quote is Russia is responsible for that atrocity. Whereas, and we'll hear from John Pilger, the famous Australian journalist soon, the evidence, the mounting evidence that Russia wasn't, is being suppressed. And when that comes out, I wonder if Abbott will use the same rhetoric then to blame the Ukrainian side if they're indeed found responsible.
Yeah, what I found stunning, Robbie, and I spent a week in Canberra last week, was the filthy lies coming from no less than Prince Charles down, you know, that Putin is Hitler.
Yeah.
I got it from one particular member that I met with that, you know, Putin is Hitler, that the invasion of Ukraine, of the Crimea was by Russia was exactly the same as Hitler invading Poland. Yeah, I mean, this is the vitriol which is absolutely, you know, polluting the truth.
Well, and there's a purpose for it, and the purpose, and this is what we have to be crystal clear on. The purpose behind this language, behind the tone that is being used, is a clear, undeniable intention to go to war on Russia first and then China.
Well, you've had, just on a clarification of that, Robbie, look, there's been no discussion in the major press about the fact that this was a Nazi coup by hardline Nazis taking over and overthrowing a democratically elected government. In this particular member's view, he discounted the fact that 95% of people in the Crimea voted to rejoin Russia because they were terrified of the new leadership coming in Kiev. In Kiev. And they also had historically, Crimea has been historically linked to Russia for centuries. So the point is that what you see with the vitriol coming from Tony Abbott and Julie Bishop is so one-sided, so incredibly vitriotic, is you have to say, well, what is the issue?
Well, and it means if and when a war breaks out, we will clearly be prepared to be dragged into it.
Oh, right? Of course.
Now,
on the other side of the world.
Let me go through some predicates, though, that just establish the fact for the viewers. 2 weeks ago, President Obama sacked his Defence Secretary, Chuck Hagel. Why? Because the biggest opposition to Obama's war plans, Craig, inside the United States comes from the Pentagon itself. The generals in the Pentagon think it's nuts. They're the one. And let me explain it. They're not saying, Mr. Obama, your plan to go to war with Russia is nuts, because Mr. Obama claims he doesn't have a plan to go to war with Russia. What they're saying is, what you're doing, we're telling you, will lead to war with Russia. Do you want a nuclear war? Keep doing what you're doing. That's what the Pentagon's saying. And Chuck Hagel was reflecting that back to the president. He got sacked for it. His replacement, Ash Carter, this guy is a deranged neoconservative nutcase who a few years ago actually not just proposed, he campaigned for a preemptive nuclear strike on North Korea, and when it was quashed, he was ropeable about it. That's what's in charge in the US at the moment. You had this very frightening incident, and it's I call it an incident because that's what it is. The US Congress passed a resolution last week, which is a war resolution. Only 10 members of the House of Representatives voted against it. This resolution, as former Congressman Ron Paul said, this is exactly like the kinds of resolutions they used to pass in the late 90s, beating their chests about Saddam Hussein, so that when there was an intention to go with war with Saddam Hussein, they could cite these resolutions to say, oh, you've already agreed to give us permission to do this stuff. That's the nature of what was just passed in the US Congress last week against Russia. Now, Lyndon LaRouche over in the US has identified that the key person in the Obama administration has to be got rid of is Victoria Nuland. Because Victoria Nuland she bridges this administration and the previous one, the Bush-Cheney administration. She's what we call a Cheney Act. She was Cheney's protege. And she's the person who directed this fascist coup in Kiev back in the first part of this year.
Yeah, she was the one that bragged about the fact that they spent $5 billion
Yes.
funding the insurgents.
She's the one that when someone she was taped on a leaked phone conversation talking to the US ambassador who said, look, the Europeans aren't going to be that happy with the direction we're going here because they want to reach a compromise. And she said, F-U-C-K the EU, right? Because their war intention is what's clear. Now, the moral quality of these guys, Craig, this Cheney crowd, is on display right now in the aftermath of this torture report being released, because this is from the CIA's own mouth, documented cases of absolute torture, and Cheney has come out from his crypt deep down under in the dungeon there beside Dracula, has come out to say this is not torture, this is not torture, whereas what they provably did is precisely what the Nazis were charged with as torture by Americans in Nuremberg after World War II, and they're trying to establish this as the new norm. This is the quality of these people in the Cheney administration that are now infecting the Obama administration, etc. Putin gave a speech that gives the other side, and the key part of his speech we have to highlight is not that it's any great speech, it's the clarity of his speech. So that if anyone in Australia or America or England thinks that we can let our governments mess around like they are and it's not going to have consequences, Putin gave a speech where he really drew the line, didn't he?
Yeah, well, he actually made it incredibly clear, Robbie. What he said, and I think I'll just read out his comments, he said, "We have no intention to become involved in a costly arms race, but at the same time we will reliably and dependably guarantee our country's defence in the new conditions. There are absolutely no doubts about this. This will be done. Russia has both the capability and the innovative solutions for this. No one," he said, "will ever attain military superiority over Russia. We have a modern and combat-ready army, as they now put it, a polite but formidable army. We have the strength, will and courage to protect our freedom." And Robbie, can I say that when you talk about the BRICS countries, this is one of the pillars of the understanding behind the BRICS countries, this question of national sovereignty. When you talk about
fiercely protective.
Look, you look at the BRICS countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Brazil is a former Portuguese colony, and the Portuguese Empire used to be was as bad as the British Empire in terms of its atrocities. Russia has never been conquered because it's a sovereign nation. India, well, look what happened to India under British colonial rule up until the point of Indira Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, who actually forced the independence of India. Look at South Africa, apartheid, right? This colonial force under apartheid, which the South Africans finally threw off after many, many, many years. And of course, China has its own internal tensions ideologically, but the fact is that China is a sovereign nation state and behaves that way. This is the power behind the BRICS. What the collapsing Western, transatlantic system sees, with the British Crown and so forth, sees the Russians as a total threat.
Yep.
They've got to deal with this threat because their system is collapsing. It's not that Russia is actually doing anything wrong. Russia has been acting like a sovereign nation state.
Well, listen, for the sake of time, I have to cut you off. Sorry about that, Craig.
That's all right.
So just quickly, 60, as part of this People Speaking Out Like Us, 60 prominent Germans, including the former Chancellor, just put their names on an ad in Germany saying, "Another war in Europe, not in our name," where they said Russia has the right to security. And what we want to do now is take you to excerpts of a speech just given by the famous Australian journalist John Pilger, where he lays it on the line exactly that this is a real serious war build-up and you've got to take it seriously and where it could lead. So let's go to that now.
These are, I believe, urgent questions. The world is facing the real possibility of major war, perhaps nuclear war, with the United States clearly determined to isolate and provoke Russia and eventually China. This truth is being turned upside down, inside out, by journalists, including those who promoted the lies that led to the bloodbath in Iraq in 2003. The most effective propaganda is often found not in Murdoch's Sun or on Fox News, but beneath a liberal halo. When the New York Times published claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, its fake evidence was believed because it wasn't Fox News, it was the New York Times. The same is true of the Washington Post and the Guardian, both of which have played a critical role in conditioning their readers to accept a new and dangerous Cold War. All three liberal newspapers have misrepresented the events in Ukraine as a malign act by Russia, when in fact the fascist-led coup in Ukraine was the work of the United States aided by Germany and NATO. This inversion of reality is so pervasive that Washington's military encirclement and intimidation of Russia is not contentious. It's not even news. It's suppressed behind a smear and scare campaign of the kind I grew up with during the first Cold War. Once again, the evil empire is coming to get us, led by blackouts I can remember. The biggest Western military build-up in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe since World War II is blacked out. Washington's secret aid to Kiev and its neo-Nazi brigades and the integration of fascists within the Kiev government and the and documented war crimes against the population of eastern Ukraine is blacked out. Evidence that contradicts propaganda that Russia was responsible for the shooting down of a Malaysian airliner is blacked out. And again, supposedly liberal media are the most convincing censors. Citing no facts, no evidence, one journalist identified a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine as the man who shot down the airliner. This man, he wrote, was known as the demon. He was a scary man who frightened the journalist. That was the front page evidence. What the Russian president has to say is of no consequence. He's a pantomime villain who can be abused with impunity. An American general who is head of NATO and straight out of Dr. Strangelove, one General Breedlove, routinely invents Russian invasions without a shred of visual evidence. His impersonation of Stanley Kubrick's General Jack D. Ripper is almost pitch perfect. Sometimes it feels like a class reunion. The drum beaters of the Washington Post, that is, beating the drum for isolating Russia, are the very same editorial writers who declared the existence of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction to be, quote, hard facts, unquote. If you wonder, wrote Robert Parry, how the world could stumble into World War III much as it did into World War I a century ago, all you need to do is look at the madness that has enveloped virtually the entire US political media structure over Ukraine, where a false narrative of white hats versus black hats took hold early and has proved impervious to facts or reason. Parry is, of course, the distinguished journalist who revealed Iran-Contra. He's one of the very few who investigate the role of the media in this dangerous game. But is it a game? This week, I think yesterday, the US Congress voted on Resolution 758, which in a nutshell says, let's get ready for war with Russia. In the news, whole countries are made to disappear. Saudi Arabia, the source of Western-backed terror across the Middle East, is not a story, except when it drives down the price of oil, as it's currently doing. Yemen has endured 12 years of American drone attacks. Who knows? Who cares?
Welcome back to the CEC Report. Craig, before the break, we were talking about the war danger and we had to finish it in a hurry. So, but that does conclude that part. We're going to move to a new topic now. Murray inquiry protects predatory banks from Glass-Steagall. So this is what we've been waiting for all year. The financial system inquiry, Joe Hockey's financial system inquiry, headed by a banker, David Murray, has finally handed down its final report.
And this comes into context, Robbie, because last year, back nearly 2 years now, we headed up the fight to stop any idea of the bail-in of people's deposits.
Yep.
That included a full-page ad in the Australian, hundreds of thousands of copies of New Citizens. It included our Glass-Steagall Now pamphlet and an intensive effort by our members to contact their MPs and make sure that our voice is heard, that there will be no bail-in, no stealing of people's deposits.
And we need Glass-Steagall instead.
And the solution is Glass-Steagall, as you say. Now, the financial systems inquiry has come out, of course, in the typical bankers' method with backdoor solutions to their means of stealing people's deposits.
Yeah, exactly. They've found a way to keep it going. So now, if we had had time, I was going to explain how the headline of this report is new higher capital requirements for the banks, which sounds like it makes sense. But let me assure the viewers it's a fraud. Look up risk weighting of assets and you'll see why it's a fraud. The percentages of capital you're being told are not real capital against all their bank's assets, it's just against a small portion of their assets, and the rest are deemed risk-free, Craig. More than 80% of banks' mortgage loans are deemed to be totally risk-free. And that's just bizarre and a fraud. That's why we say it's a fraud. But anyway, you look that up yourself. The big thing was on the two ticket, and I must say, Glass-Steagall defined this inquiry because apart from us saying that, this inquiry happens in a global context where every single jurisdiction in the world is debating Glass-Steagall. And Murray knew it, right? And he has used his influence as a former banker to make sure the bankers were shielded from that.
They didn't even include the 700 odd signers that were calling for Glass-Steagall in the actual public submissions.
If you did make a submission, and we're one of the more than 700 people to make a submission on Glass-Steagall, look up the CEC's press release on this on our webpage, and you'll see the link where the page on that in the final report excludes any accounting of that in their statistical analysis of where the submissions came from, and they deliberately did so. So that's outrageous itself. Here's the bottom line. Murray said the banks can sell bail-inable bonds, which is what you said. It's the backdoor bail-in, right?
This means that households wear the losses of the banks, and most
through your super funds, through your insurance funds, and whatever. So, and that's what will happen. So we talked about that a few weeks ago. You can watch the YouTube version of that report. The big one though is Murray rejected any need for Glass-Steagall, but he didn't mention Glass-Steagall, Craig. He did mention ring fencing. I want to read the quote because he said, now he's the one who raised ring fencing. He said, the inquiry does not recommend pursuing industry-wide structural reforms such as ring fencing. These measures can have high costs and require changes for all institutions regardless of the institution's specific risk. Neither APRA nor the RBA nor the banking industry saw a strong case for these reforms. Now, just quickly, he's the one who raised ring fencing back in August, not us. We were raising Glass-Steagall. He raised ring fencing in order to deflect from Glass-Steagall. At the time, though, he said the idea made sense. To raise it, Craig, is to acknowledge the problem, though. There is a cultural problem between having investment banks tied in with retail banks. I want to quote Don Argus on that. He goes, the former chief executive of the NAB said, you actually don't want investment banking on a commercial bank balance sheet that comprises depositors' funds. That's what he said. So Murray was kind of acknowledging that. But now he's saying, no, we don't do it because it's too high a cost, the banking industry said. To say it's too high a cost confirms our argument. The cost can only be too high if investment banking is so intimately intertwined with retail banking that the funds of every single Australian are in constant danger. That means it's got to be done because of the cost, right? That's the point. So we're going to keep discussing this after the break. Let's take a quick break now. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing the Financial System Inquiry final report by David Murray. And before the break, we were just talking about how he's used his power to shield Australia's banks from a Glass-Steagall banking separation. I want to talk about, we use this term predatory banks, right? Because we've got a live example right in front of Australians right now, Craig, and we've followed this story for a long time. So look at the rural debt crisis, especially there's a hotspot in Queensland right now, and the broadcaster Alan Jones has been making a big issue about it, but I'm sure a lot of Australians have heard about it, seen it on the news. There's a case there where, and there's more than one, but there's one that's quite famous now, where a farmer, an 80-year-old farmer who's lived there all his life near Winton, grazier, sorry, you couldn't call graziers farmers, grazier, he's never missed a debt payment, never, yet he was foreclosed on because the banks revalued and valued down his property, and therefore the percentage, the value of his asset as a property compared to the debt, the ratio went up, and that was the excuse to foreclose. Now, you met a state MP in Western Australia, Dr. Graham Jacobs, who's made us think about this as a conflict of interest that the banks have.
Yeah.
The banks are in business with the receivers and with the valuers, so it becomes in their interest to foreclose aggressively.
Well, the problem here you got, Robbie, is the fact that the banking system is a private institution. It's out to make massive profits.
Massive profits.
They don't care about where those profits come from. A lot of it's from speculation in derivatives. A lot of it's plain speculation, and the actual problem doesn't exist with the banks. Banks are going to be banks. They're going to be predatory by nature. They're private institutions. You have to go back to what Ben Chipley was trying to propose back in the 1930s, where it's the role of government to control those banks. First and foremost, you have to have a highly regulated system of the government controlling the private banking system, because private bankers will never extend the credit or do what is necessary for the public good, for the development of the economy as a whole. They'll only do what's in their personal interest.
And Craig, that's why it's actually a bad sign that what's happened in the last 24 hours, where the ANZ has come out and announced it will have a 12-month freeze on foreclosures, because that's a voluntary action on its part, right, which seems good, except it shouldn't have been left up to them to do it voluntarily. The government should have forced them and all banks to do it.
And I think also, Dr. Jacobs was talking about the sweetheart deal between the land valuers, the property values, and the banks. You know, they're the real sweetheart deal. Now, that's not illegal, but Robbie, this is typical of what happens when you allow private enterprise to govern the livelihoods and also, I would say, the physical economy of our country. We need large numbers of family farmers, because family farmers are by far the most efficient producers on the land. And people could say big corporate farmings are more efficient, but we're losing more and more farmers, more and more family farmers.
Okay, let's just illustrate that. We're going to put on the screen two graphs. One shows the growth in farm debt compared to farm output over 40 years from 1969. And then we're going to follow that up with our own graph that we made a few years ago that shows the collapse in numbers of family farms from 200,000 back in 1969 down to less than 40,000.
These are family farmers that are viable, Robbie, and I mean, I think the graph tells the story. I did the work on this, so I know exactly the fact that we have an absolute holocaust as far as family farmers are concerned. And historically, family farmers look after the land. They are much more productive, and they're also better for communities.
And the business stays local, etc. So this is the kind of predation by banks that's been protected by this financial system inquiry. But look, that's it for this week's CEC Report, Craig. To YouTube viewers, or Channel 31 viewers, Merry Christmas, and tune in next week for more.